Over the past few years, I've really been enjoying painting with side feed airbrushes, and in this week's video, we're going to take a look at one that comes in at an excellent price point. This airbrush is made by a brand called Creos, and this model is the PS-276. This is the third airbrush that I've owned from Creos, and like the other two that I checked out, I'm very impressed with the build quality. There's very few things not to like here. I bought this model about a year ago, paying just under $100 for it. And at that price point, it has a lot to offer. So let's go into this review, talk about the pros and a few of the cons. The PS-276 has a needle and nozzle size of 0.3 millimeters, so I would consider this a general use airbrush. A nozzle size of 0.3 is excellent for all types of paintings. It's a bit smaller than that standard mid-size, which is usually around 0.35 or so. So you're not going to have any problems getting in plenty of micro detail and thin lines. And if you want to spray some airbrush paints right out of the bottle, this airbrush is going to be more forgiving than a detail airbrush. There's no information about this cup size on their website or in the manual, but I measured it and it's very similar to an Iwata Eclipse, which has a cup size of about 1/4 of an ounce or 7 milliliters. But the one thing that I really love about this paint cup is that although it's a side feed, it's gravity assisted. This means that it pulls the paint from the bottom of the cup rather than having to pull it up. So that's nice. It's going to help with that response rate. You also get this large screw that goes on the other side of the airbrush opposite of the paint cup. And what's nice about this is that you can move the cup to the left side or to the right side. I paint with my right hand, so the cup for me is always placed on the right side of the airbrush. And I just want to point out that this cup and the threading on it just feels very well made. It doesn't feel cheap at all. It just feels really solid. If you watch my other GSI Creos airbrush reviews, you'll know that I'm just so impressed with the build quality of these airbrushes. For the price point, I can't understand how they do it because it's one of the only brands that competes with the much more expensive Iwatas and Harder & Steenbecks. Underneath the macro lens, the chrome coating is flawless. There's no imperfections, no blemishes. Really nice to see. Now, I've only owned this airbrush for 1 year, painted with it quite a bit, but it's held up very well during that time. And before we get to the breakdown, let me just show you how quickly it is to change out the cup. You can see right here, it can go on either side, whether you're a lefty or a righty. And the threads on it are pretty wide, so it screws in very quickly. Once you have it screwed in, you could just adjust this little chucking nut here to lock it in. The rear handle of this airbrush does have a needle stop or a needle limiter. This is a small screw that's placed on the back of the airbrush. And if you tighten down this screw, it just limits how far back you could pull the trigger. And this could be very useful for new painters, for those of you who might not have that muscle memory built up yet. And it could be a useful feature for some to prevent you from spraying too much paint. Breaking down this airbrush is very easy to do. The first thing I'm doing here is unscrewing this screw or bolt and then unscrewing the paint cup. And moving along to the back of the airbrush, I need to unscrew this rear handle, loosen up this chuck, and pull out the needle. This part right here is called the needle spring case, and you could adjust the spring tension by how much you tighten this down. And this spring assembly consists of 3 parts: the guide, the housing, and the spring itself. It's basically the same thing you'll see in every airbrush and nearly identical to Iwata's. The trigger itself is the standard round trigger with a small piston at the bottom which has a hinge on it, and this is used to press down on the air valve assembly inside the body of the airbrush. These round triggers are nothing new, nothing special, but I've always found them to be very comfortable and they give a good amount of grip for longer painting sessions. At the front of the airbrush, we have the nozzle cap. This always needs to be on the airbrush in order for it to spray paint. And it's a pretty simple one. There's no sort of air holes to evenly direct the airflow over the nozzle tip, but sometimes simpler is better because there's nothing to clog here. Very easy to keep clean. And we'll see later when we get to the spray test how well this airbrush performs. When I bought this airbrush, it also came with a small needle protective cap at the end of it. Unfortunately, I lost it. I just don't know where I put it. So I do apologize for not showing it in this video. But overall, the build quality and attention to detail is excellent on this airbrush. It's a nice, simple design with high quality parts. It's also very fast and easy to break down, which is always a plus to me. So moving along to the negatives or the cons, this first one is probably just subjective, probably just my opinion, but I find it kind of annoying, and that's the angle of this air valve assembly. The stem of the air valve assembly on the PS-276 is kind of angled backwards, and when I hold this airbrush with my normal grip, this angle kind of makes it feel like it's falling forward. So again, this is probably just personal preference, but I don't feel that this airbrush is all that well balanced. It feels a bit too front heavy, like it's angled forward, and that's all because of that angle of the air valve assembly. I wish that they set this at 90 degrees like on their PS-771 and pretty much every other airbrush. If you're new to airbrushing and you don't know what I'm talking about, here's an example. This is the Harder & Steenbeck Evolution. You can see the air valve assembly here is straight down at a 90-degree angle. And this is what you'll see in almost every airbrush brand, like 99% of them. And when I hold this in my hand, it just feels very balanced. The airbrush feels like it's pointing straight. It doesn't feel like it's back heavy or front heavy. The reason that I decided to buy this airbrush was because I wanted a side feed airbrush that was a bit better for some wider applications and for spraying some thicker paint. Before I bought this airbrush, the only side feed airbrushes that I've owned were Iwata Microns, and they're awesome airbrushes. The problem with them is they're just really made for detail. They're not great when you're trying to spray some thicker paint or if you're trying to spray a wider area. So last autumn, we painted this landscape on this channel, and this sky here is a perfect example of what I wanted this airbrush to paint. This scene is on a clear day, so the sky doesn't have any clouds, and what it is a very smooth gradient from a darker blue to a lighter blue. And as I was spraying here, the airbrush did an incredible job giving me that transition from the darker to the lighter color. I was also spraying the color white here, and if you ever painted with an airbrush and used white, which is titanium dioxide, you'll know that it's one of the more difficult paints to spray. The pigments have to be milled slightly larger in titanium dioxide to get that right opacity, so it's just kind of a more difficult color to spray. It tends to clog easier, and if your PSI is too low, you'll notice that it may be a bit grainier because it tends to also dry on the tip easier than other paints. But I have to say that this airbrush, this Creos, did an excellent job with the white. It sprayed it as well as it could. In the last few weeks, I've been working on this different landscape, and what I'm doing here is just the first few layers of adding some rocks along the shore. What I needed to do here was use the color Payne's Gray to glaze over this texture, and then also come in between each one of these rocks and just spray in a shadow to the right of each one. So I switched over to the PS-276 from my Micron, and it just did an incredible job. Put the paint exactly where I wanted it to, and what's nice about it is it definitely put out a higher volume of paint than a Micron, a detail airbrush. And this is very helpful for an area like this where I don't need a crazy amount of detail. I just need to get some shadows in. This higher volume puts out the paint quicker and darker, and it just makes the process of painting a lot faster. The airspeed and atomization just felt very nice, felt very controlled on this airbrush. When I checked it through the atomometer, I got an airspeed right around 5.9 meters per second. And that falls in line with what I expected to see from a general use airbrush like this with a needle and nozzle size of 0.3. Moving along to the trigger response test, this airbrush is incredible. If you look at my trigger finger, you'll see that I'm pulling it back the smallest amount, just a hair back, and I'm getting paint at that same point. I would say that the Creos brand is right up there with Badger and Iwata when it comes to response rate. The trigger is just incredibly responsive. It does exactly what you want it to do. Very happy to see this with this airbrush as well. Regarding the spray consistency, this airbrush is also very good. You can see that this line is extremely clean. There's no breaks, no stutters in it. There was one or two little hiccups here in the beginning. Not a big deal. I still think this airbrush did a great job. In painting fine lines, this airbrush is excellent. As I showed in that video a few weeks ago, you could paint a fine line with any airbrush, it really doesn't matter. Just thin your paint down, hold your airbrush right off the surface, and any airbrush is going to give you about a hair-sized line. One thing that I notice about this airbrush is if you own it, you want to make sure that before you put it away, you unscrew the paint cup and just flush out the inside here. Paint tends to easily collect and build up in these openings and around these threads. So you want to make sure that you don't leave it there so that it starts drying overnight. At the end of a painting session, I unscrew the cup and then just flush this out with some distilled water. That way, nothing's left in there and it'll be ready to go the next time you paint. So yeah, it's an awesome airbrush. It comes in at a really great price. If you could pick this up for under $100 US, I think you're getting a great buy. This brand GSI Creos has gotten very popular in the last few years and for very good reasons. Everyone I've talked to and all the reviews that I've read and watched, everyone seems to love this brand, and I completely agree. I think they're phenomenal and they just come in at such a great price point. So if you're looking for a very nice side feed airbrush, the Creos PS-276 is definitely a great one to check out. Awesome airbrush and a really great price. So thank you guys for watching. I'll be back here next week.